It's May 24th, 1881, in London, Ontario, Canada. James Drennan, an employee of the London Evening Advertiser, is standing on the upper deck of the Steamboat Victoria. He has a spectacular view of the hillside and farms on both sides of the Thames River. It's a gorgeous spring day. The blue skies and sunshine provide a perfect backdrop for the exuberant passengers who have just enjoyed an afternoon at Waterworks Park. It's 5:00 p.m., and the Victoria is filled to capacity with day trippers who are eager to get back home. Drennan enjoys the atmosphere, but can't help but be a little uncomfortable. There is almost no space to move about on the ship, even on the upper deck. As the ship gets underway, he senses a bit of a bump and hears a scraping sound. But no worries, all is well. But then suddenly, the boat begins listing to port, causing some great concern to some, but others seem to rejoice in the rocking of the ship. Drennan is suspicious, but still, the Victoria continues on. At about 5:30, the Victoria slowly approached Griffith's Dam. Drennan spots Captain Donald Rankin. "You have a big crowd today, Captain," he says, almost fishing for information. The captain replies, "Yes, I couldn't keep the people off. They would crowd on, although I told them there were 2 more boats coming after." Drennan nods and turns to walk away when he notices water rushing in down below over the bottom deck. Looking down the staircase, he sees the water is ankle deep. The crowd on board is excited and rushing from one side of the boat to the other. Captain Rankin shouts, "Stand still and do not crowd so much to the side." Drennan holds on to the railing as the Victoria listed badly to starboard and then back to port. Just then he hears a horrible crash and a loud hissing sound, followed by shrieks of terror. A moment later, James Drennan and all others on the upper deck crash down on everyone still on the lower deck. Drennan is one of the lucky ones. He is thrown into the water and is able to swim to shore. The Victoria Day disaster, the Steamboat Victoria, today on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, Tales of Mishaps, Misfortune, and Misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. The city of London, Ontario, Canada is situated roughly halfway between Detroit, Michigan and Toronto, Ontario, on a narrow strip of Canada separating Lake Huron and Lake Erie. In the late 19th century, it was a bustling town of about 19,000 people. Like London, England, the city is intersected by a river called the Thames. The people of London, Ontario enjoyed strolling along the riverfront among numerous parks and greenways. In 1878, the London waterworks system was completed in order to supply a reliable water source to London's growing community. A dam was built at the village of Byron, near a freshwater spring, along with a pumping station and a reservoir. The site near the pumping station, along the southern shore of the river, became known as Waterworks Park, also called Chestnut Park, a beautiful 4-mile greenway where residents congregated for picnics, gatherings, and games. The building of the dam caused the upstream water level of the Thames to rise, and prompted the citizens of London to venture out on the river in their own boats. The Thames Navigation Company and the London Waterworks Line were soon established to carry passengers between various points along the river. By late 1878, the Thames Navigation Company, operated by Captain Thomas Wasty, had built the steamers Forest City and the Princess Louise, and the London Waterworks Line added the Enterprise in 1879 and the Admiral in 1880. These were modest stern-wheel paddle steamers. With flat bottoms, they were built to navigate the shallow waters of the Thames, carrying anywhere from about 50 to a couple hundred passengers at a time. These ferries operated regularly in the spring and summer between London and the village of Byron, with 3 additional stops along the route, each with its own wharf. Shortly after beginning its service in 1879, the Enterprise caught fire and sank. But the London Waterworks Line raised the ship the following spring. The ship was rebuilt and then renamed Victoria. The Victoria was built slightly larger, at 80 feet long, 32 feet wide, with a capacity for 220 seated passengers, and standing room for an additional 300. She was painted a beautiful glossy white, with royal blue and gingerbread trim. She was a double-decker ship, powered by a 14-foot-long, 60-horsepower boiler, and could travel from London to Byron within just 30 minutes. Passengers could relax on the hurricane deck, enjoy the views, and listen to music from the ship's band or piano player. Before the newly rebuilt vessel was launched, it was inspected by the Government of Ontario and was deemed as safe and seaworthy. On April 29, 1880, the Victoria was put back into service, joining the Princess Louise and Forest City, transporting up to 1,600 passengers a day, round trip between London and Byron, at a cost of just 15 cents. But the pleasant afternoon trips on the water soon took a more dangerous turn. The captains of the various steamships had a sometimes heated rivalry with each other. On May 25, 1880, the London Free Press wrote of what transpired the day before between the two ships. It is to be regretted that the spirit of rivalry between those in charge of the Forest City and Victoria was manifested in such a manner as to alarm the passengers and even imperil their lives. It was too marked to be called an accident and too flagrant to be treated with silence. On going down the river, the two vessels were side by side, and being of about equal speed, remained so for some little time. The master of Victoria claims that the master of the Forest City deliberately forced the Forest City onto the Victoria and crowded the later boat onto the shore. Unfortunately, a large tree overhung the steamer, and its big branches raked the covering of the upper deck, terribly alarming the passengers, who received a yet ruder shock when the vessel struck the shore. Several ladies fainted, and a scene of wild disorder ensued on board the Victoria. That, however, was not the end of it. When the Forest City was again returning to the waterworks, the delayed Victoria gave the signal for the Forest City to go to the left. This signal should have been obeyed, but it was not done in time, and a collision was the result. The passengers got a bad shaking up, and some were thrown from their seats. As the helms were turned, one went to shore on each side of the river. The murmuring, which was loud and long, began to grow into profanity when the steamer got off, reached the dock, unloaded, and took on one of the maddest crowds that ever bought excursion tickets. A few months later, the Forest City again collided with the Victoria. It could not be determined whether the collision was intentional or accidental. On weekends and holidays, the ships were jam-packed with passengers hoping for a lovely day on the water. In this simpler time, even a short trip out of the city was an exciting excursion, and many families enjoyed picnics in the open air for recreation. Prior to the 1881 season, the Victoria was sold to the Thames Navigation Company. The Victoria's machinery was repaired, a small cabin was rebuilt on the upper deck to accommodate the female passengers, her seats were repainted, and her boiler was relocated 5 feet forward in an effort to increase her speed. Victoria Day, May 24, 1881, was shaping up to be another beautiful day on the water. During the preceding year, the Victoria had become the darling of the fleet and was highly preferred among the public. The Victoria launched a bit early that day, at 9 a.m., to start its passengers on their day. Children ran around the decks, waving at farmers on the shore. Passengers waved to others on the Great Western Railway as their train passed by on the bridge overhead. Along the route, stops were made at the Woodland Cemetery and Ward's Hotel, where a small number of passengers disembarked. The vast majority were going to spend their afternoon at Waterworks Park in Byron. Throughout the day, the Victoria made several round trips before docking at 3:30 p.m. in London for its next departure at 5 p.m. While docked in London, the ship's captain, Donald Rankin, learned the Forest City had been grounded nearby on a sandy shoal. The Princess Louise was attempting to pull her free using cables, but was having difficulty. With these two ships unavailable, it was left to the Victoria to transport all the remaining passengers from Byron back to London. Captain Rankin requested for the Princess Louise to take some of the passengers back to London, but his request was refused. Rankin departed London early before his 5 p.m. scheduled departure, to return to Byron and begin transporting everyone back to London. The crowd at the wharf in Byron was immense, with 4,000 people having been taken to Waterworks Park on board the 3 steamships throughout the day. The grounding of the Forest City had created a backlog waiting to be transported back to London. As Rankin pulled into the wharf, he ordered his crew of 6 to be mindful of overcrowding. Nevertheless, the restless throng of people rushed on board, eager to get home. The ship quickly filled to its capacity, and even more crammed themselves on board. In a matter of minutes, an estimated 640 people were on board the Victoria, meant to carry about 500 at most. They jostled, pushed, and shoved to get a seat or a prime location along the rail. The crew walked around the ship, announcing to the passengers that the ship was overcrowded, and asked for volunteers to disembark. The upper deck had become overcrowded too, making the ship top-heavy. So much so that Captain Rankin ordered some passengers to the lower deck. The crew reminded everyone that more ferries would be coming if they could just wait for the next ship. Despite these pleas and a warning that the captain would not depart while the ship is overcrowded, only about 20 passengers disembarked. Frustrated and determined to get everyone back to London, Captain Rankin pulled away from the wharf, saying he was not responsible for the large crowd. The Victoria sat low in the water from the extra weight of the passengers. Its usual 16 inches of clearance above the water was now just 8, and water was splashing up onto the deck. Many of the passengers went to one side of the ship to wave goodbye to those on shore, causing the ship to list to one side. James Drennan said, "As I looked down the staircase, I noticed the water ankle deep below. The crowd seemed excited and kept rushing from one side to the other. The captain had told them repeatedly to stand still." Despite the listing of the ship and the water below deck, the Victoria departed for London. Shortly after leaving the wharf, the boat scraped its bottom along the rocks, creating a gash in the hull and allowing water to enter the lower deck. Water continued to splash up on the deck, and the ship was slowly sinking deeper and deeper. Passengers were aware of the problem, but were not at all troubled. The river was shallow, and some joked that the ship had previously become grounded when passing over a tin can on the riverbed. As the boat continued on, it rocked uneasily back and forth. James Drennan became worried. A man nearby replied that he and his daughters could simply wade to shore if the boat sank. Some passengers decided to jump into the river and swim the short distance to shore rather than stay on the unstable boat. By this time, the Princess Louise had started toward Byron to pick up more passengers, and passed the Victoria going the opposite direction. A great many of the excited passengers rushed to the port side to wave to the Princess Louise, causing the ship again to list badly. Captain Rankin saw the water pouring over the side and into the lower deck, and knew that he would not be able to make it all the way to London. He refused to pick up any passengers at Woodland Cemetery or at Ward's Hotel. Spotting a sandy shoal ahead, his plan was to ground the Victoria there, save the boat, and provide for an easy evacuation for the passengers. As Rankin began maneuvering the Victoria on course for the shoal, 2 men from the Forest City Rowing Club approached the Victoria. They were racing each other, and this was of spectacular interest to the passengers on board, who rushed to the starboard side to catch a glimpse of the race. The overcrowded and overweight Victoria listed harshly to starboard, prompting the crew to order everyone to the port side. The groaning and creaking Victoria corrected itself, but then began listing to port. Suddenly, the 60-horsepower, 1,500-pound boiler broke free of its mounting and snapped away from its water and steam connections. The superheated metal boiler crashed through the wall of the boiler room and careened out of control toward the port side. The rolling, steaming cauldron flattened people and spewed its scalding hot water and steam, killing everyone in its path. The boiler finally crashed into the support stanchions, holding up the top deck. The stanchions and the port side railing splintered into oblivion, and the upper deck came crashing down, crushing all who were trapped on the lower deck. Those on the upper deck were thrown into the muddy river as the Victoria's port side dipped under the water. Survivor William Soper recalled, "I was standing on the north side of the upper deck when the crash came. I was hurled into the water with 500 others. I sank to the bottom but managed to climb up on the people, but in turn was climbed up on by others. I then exerted myself for a final struggle and got on top again and reached the shore. The screams which arose from the drowning mass were terrific. Free of the weight of the passengers and with the upper deck collapsed, the Victoria righted itself and then quickly sank. Anyone who wasn't crushed by the weight of the upper deck was trapped under its weight and was drowned. Others were cast into the shallow river, and some trapped in the mud underneath the sinking ship. Some who were thrown clear of the ship were able to swim to shore. One who survived the wreck was a young boy named Benjamin Eilber, who said, 'I was riding on the upper deck when the boat started to rock. Some of the passengers thought the rolling motion was great fun, and they even started to sing, 'One more river to cross.' I went down to the lower deck so that if the worst came, I would be nearer the water and could swim. I was standing beside the pile of cordwood fuel talking to a policeman, and after several bad lurches, we decided to swim for shore. As soon as we were in the water, the boat took a violent lurch and started to go down. The policeman and I were far enough away by this time that we were not trapped in the falling wreckage. The women on board were wearing heavy, layered Victorian-era dresses, which quickly became waterlogged. Even those who survived the loose boiler, the collapse of the upper deck, and the ship listing over, were dragged to the bottom by their heavy clothing. Many in the water could not swim, which was common in this time period, and they were drowned. Sisters Henrietta and Mabel Hogan were traveling alone together. The women were thrown into the river when the upper deck collapsed. Mabel quickly went under, and Henrietta grabbed Mabel by the ribbon around her throat, but could not hold on. Henrietta watched as Mabel disappeared under the water. Henrietta was rescued by a priest, and when he returned her to her parents, she was still holding Mabel's ribbon in her hand. The Thames River was filled with screams and chaos. Some reached the surface of the water only to be pulled down again by another desperate soul. Men, women, and children fought over the smallest bits of debris to hold onto, grabbing and pulling each other underwater in a desperate and selfish struggle to survive. After being thrown from the ship, survivor Will Skinner helplessly watched his sister be pulled under by another frantic swimmer. The stress and panic of the accident even caused a 13-year-old boy to suffer a heart attack and die as he tried to pull himself out of the muddy river. Survivors who made it to the riverbank were in a state of shock and grief as they tried to grasp the reality of what had just happened to them. They wandered the fields of the farms along the river, searching for help. One farmer assumed they were drunk and ordered them off his land. Witnesses on shore immediately began helping survivors or went to get help. Portions of fences were torn away and thrown into the water to provide flotation devices. Two nude swimmers who happened to be nearby attempted to help with the rescue but ended up being drowned themselves. Within just a few minutes, horse-drawn carriages began arriving on scene to take survivors into London to receive care. Frank Moore, a carriage driver, described what he saw upon arriving at the scene. "We heard the most fearful, sudden, terrible wails and cries and shouts. It rings in my ears. The day was so beautiful and everything was so happy and all holiday-like. And then came those awful wails. The victims were fighting like mad things. The worst thing was to see mothers and fathers trying to reach down and pull up their children who had been crowded under and were drowning. Then the parents beat and pulled each other down. They were walking, yes, walking on each other." The two rowers who were racing past the Victoria were Harry Nichols and Michael Reedy. They were distraught over the disaster and immediately pulled people into their small vessels and rowed them to shore. The two men saved at least 15 people in this manner. Nearby worker John Curtis witnessed the disaster and waded into the river to help. He pulled many bodies from the water throughout the evening. But 2 weeks later, John Curtis contracted pneumonia, reportedly from his time in the cold water, and died. After learning of the Victoria's demise, the captain of the Princess Louise purposely grounded his boat and let its passengers off a mile from the wharf so he could assist in the rescue. The Princess Louise was transformed into a floating morgue as the bodies of children, men, and women, old and young, were pulled from the river and placed on its decks. By 6:30 p.m., news of the wreck had reached London, and rescue efforts were swiftly organized. Torches lined the shoreline near the site of the wreck as recovery and identification efforts continued into the night. At 10 o'clock p.m., the Princess Louise departed for London with 157 bodies on board. Search efforts continued overnight, and 18 more bodies were recovered by morning, and an additional 4 were pulled to the surface later on May 25th. The London Field Battery fired artillery shells at the wreck, believing it would break up the wreckage and release more bodies. But this had no effect. The waterworks dam was opened to allow the water levels to lower, resulting in 2 more bodies being recovered. An incredible story of survival came to light in the wake of the disaster. Determined to save his family, passenger John Fitzpatrick held his wife in one arm, his daughter in the other arm, and clenched his baby granddaughter's clothes in his teeth. He was able to swim to shore and saved his entire family. The following day, May 25th, the community began to bury their dead relatives and loved ones. Of over 600 on board the Victoria, it is estimated between 180 and 200 perished. Willie Glass, 23, and his 19-year-old fiancée, Fanny Cooper, were included among the dead. The couple were scheduled to be married in just 2 weeks. Instead, separate funerals were held for them at their respective homes, but they were joined together one last time during the procession to the cemetery. They lie together permanently in adjoining graves at Mount Pleasant Cemetery in West London. A single headstone at their gravesite reads, "They were lovely in their lives, and in death they were not divided." Almost everyone in the community of 19,000 people lost somebody in the accident. One family, the Friars, tragically lost 5 members of their family. The City of London announced an official decree stating black armbands should be worn by citizens of the city for a period of 1 month, and all businesses and schools closed for 2 days. The London Free Press wrote, "The catastrophe is one that can scarcely be appreciated in all its magnitude. But if the roofs of all the houses in London could be raised today, the scenes of woe would make the strongest man weep." Queen Victoria herself sent her condolences to the town of London. Coffins in London sold out within a day and were in short supply. Funeral services and burials were hastily arranged all over the city. Drivers of carriages shamefully charged exorbitant rates to transport the dead, at double their normal rate or sometimes more. Some unscrupulous men delivered bodies from the wreck site to their homes, only to demand a fee from the grieving family. A.B. Powell and Company took the opportunity to run advertising aimed at families in mourning, announcing their low prices for mourning dress material and dressmaking services. A committee of local citizens gathered on May 25th to discuss a memorial to the victims. Among the group was John Labatt of the Labatt Brewing Company. A discussion was held about funding a stone monument, but the practicality of a monument at this time was questioned, with one man exclaiming, "The families of the victims are crying for bread. How ridiculous to offer them a stone." An official inquest was launched in June of 1881 by coroner Dr. J. Flock, and a jury was assembled to evaluate the testimony. Survivors from the wreck testified that the ship was badly overcrowded, and the passengers seemed to take great delight in running back and forth from side to side to rock the ship. Some speculation was made about a pre-existing hole in the Victoria's hull, giving credence to the possibility of the Victoria being damaged when it scraped the bottom. The coroner's inquest specifically looked into the circumstances of the death of Fanny Cooper, although neither she nor anyone else was ever specifically mentioned. After hearing all testimony, the jury declared Captain Rankin was responsible for the wreck of the Victoria. Engineer George Parrish was also found responsible, as it was he who passed the inspection of the Victoria, declaring her seaworthy prior to the season. The jury determined Parrish was guilty of neglecting to inform Captain Rankin of the Victoria's poor condition. The jury also ruled that the boiler must have been improperly installed and found fault in the design and installation of the support stanchions for the upper deck. Donald Rankin and George Parrish were arrested, charged with manslaughter, and given a $3,000 bond. On September 22nd, a Middlesex County grand jury determined there was not enough evidence to indict them. Charges were dropped, and both men were released. Neither the public nor the press were satisfied with the ruling. The Toronto Globe wrote, "The verdict of the coroner's jury is by no means satisfactory. The death of Miss Cooper was entirely ignored, and it is impossible to discover whether the jury believed she perished as the result of carelessness or negligence of individuals. The capsizing of the boat is said to have been caused by water in the hold, a finding that, in our opinion, is very ill supported by the evidence." Ultimately, no official cause of the sinking of the Victoria was determined, and nobody was held accountable. However, the disaster did have lingering consequences. Though steam ferries continued to operate on the Thames River, their popularity declined, with many people reluctant to travel on them. A flood in 1883 washed the Princess Louise over the Waterworks Dam, smashing it into bits and killing 7 people. This same flood also damaged the Forest City. Steamboat ferry service on the Thames stopped altogether for several years following the flood, as the public's confidence waned further. Locals stopped visiting Waterworks Park and found other areas such as Port Stanley for their recreation and swimming. In 1887, noting the decreased use of Waterworks Park, the London Free Press wrote, "When shall a steamboat be again put on the Thames River? It is too bad that the citizens are not able, as of yore, to enjoy a sail down the Thames and spend a day at the Waterworks, or Chestnut Park as it is called. Thousands used to visit the park, but since the accident it has lapsed into its old obscurity." A brief attempt to resurrect the ferry service on the Thames was launched in 1888 by Captain David Foster, launching the new ships City of London and Thames. Foster refused to carry more than 300 passengers on any voyage, but still, public confidence remained low, and locals were not keen on boarding the ferries. By 1894, the City of London was retired. The Thames continued until 1899, when it caught fire and sank near the Waterworks Dam. In 1895, the London Street Railway opened, an electric-powered train offering transportation from downtown London to Waterworks Park and Byron, further diminishing the need for steam ferries. In September of 1881, parents who lost children in the disaster raised money to build a small brick building on the property of the Protestant Orphans' Home in North London. Above the front door, an inscription read, "In Memoriam, May 1881." The cottage served as an infirmary for the orphanage and later was a schoolroom. The cottage ultimately was demolished years later. Waterworks Park was officially renamed to Springbank Park in 1894, and today it is the largest park in London. It is a popular spot for families, offering walking and biking trails, a wading pool, and soccer fields. In 1958, Storybook Gardens, a nursery rhyme-themed park and zoo, opened inside the park. Shortly after opening, a sea lion later nicknamed Slippery escaped into the Thames River and was later spotted in Sandusky, Ohio, before being returned. As of 2012, no animals reside at Storybook Gardens. The remains of the Victoria were largely destroyed during the search and rescue operation. The wooden portions of the boat broke apart or rotted away, but the metal boiler remained on the river bottom for several years and was a popular swimming spot. The tragedy of the Steamboat Victoria is still remembered by Londoners today. A blue Ontario heritage plaque in memory of the accident is located on the south side of the Thames River, near the site of the wreck, and describes the Victoria as one of Canada's worst maritime disasters. Alongside the plaque is the blue painted anchor of the Victoria, which was recovered from the wreck. Graves of the victims of the Victoria can be found today at Woodland and Mount Pleasant cemeteries. That's going to do it for the Victoria Day disaster. Thank you so much for listening. I'd like to give a special thank you to my latest supporters. Thanks to Bob and Deb C., plus an anonymous donor. Your support is very much appreciated. If you'd like to support the show, you can make a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod. You can also support the show by subscribing to the Into History podcast channel, where you will get ad-free access to this and many other fantastic history podcasts. Go to intohistory.com/shipwreckspod to subscribe. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow the show on social media at shipwreckspod or at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. Thanks again for listening. Please join me again in 2 weeks, but until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.